Well, hello. Pastor Bob Cook here, the interim pastor at the Greencastle Presbyterian Church in Greencastle, Pennsylvania, where we're getting ready for Christmas Eve in a couple of days. And this is the fourth and the final installment of our Advent series, The Heart That Grew Three Sizes, which is a takeoff on the story of The Grinch Who Stole Christmas by Dr. Seuss. I'm sure you know the story pretty well by this time, but in this segment, I'll just recap the ending. I'm not giving anything away because everybody's seen this. It was released around 1964-65, and then in 2000 there was a Jim Carrey movie about the Grinch, so everybody knows it. But the Grinch had a heart that was two sizes too small, and he was so self-centered. All he could think about was himself and his own aloneness and his misery, and he was miserable that other people weren't miserable with him. And as Christmas came, it just irked him. And he wanted to make other people hurt the way he was hurting, which is something that people often will do. People in pain may want to cause other people to feel the same kind of pain, some crazy way it makes them feel better. So his plan was to steal Christmas. He crept into Whoville in the dark of night. And he began to take all the trappings of Christmas, the buttons, the bows, the bags, the boxes, even the roast beast and everything that came with it. You know the story pretty well. And he loads all of this stuff house to house on this very large Santa-like bag on a sleigh that was pulled by his little dog Max, and took it back up the mountain to Mount Crumpet where he lived, and was about to push it over a precipice. He was very pleased with himself, except he heard something as the sun came up. He stopped and he listened and he peered over the edge of the precipice, and he saw the entire Who community had gathered in the Whoville Square, formed a circle where the tree used to be, that now no longer was there, and they began to sing. And this confounded the Grinch. It was unimaginable to the Grinch. Christmas came without a single button or bow or gift or bag or box or even the roast beast. And then he thought about it some more, and it really puzzled him that Christmas is not something you hold in your hand. And he had a brand new thought, that Christmas is something you hold in your heart. And something magical was beginning to happen in him. And just then he looks up and he sees the sled just about tipping over that precipice. And something more mysterious happened. He actually was feeling. If you look at the Jim Carrey movie, he sort of convulses a while and he says, "I'm feeling." And his cold, cold heart was now warm and caring. And he ran to the sled, and with super Grinchy strength, he rescued the sled, and that is when his heart grew 3 sizes bigger. He turned it around and he rode it all the way back to the village of Whoville, right in the center, and then began to give all that stuff from Christmas back to them. So the question that Dr. Seuss was posing in this wonderful story is, how does a heart that's too small grow? And of course, the answer that he gives us is, it grows by caring. Now take a few minutes, and you might want to pause the video. I'll be here when you come back. And you might think, what stories are there in the Bible where people cared enough to make a positive difference? So I'll wait a few minutes as you think about what stories there might be in the Bible where people cared to make a difference. Okay, glad you took some time to pause and thought about that. I thought of several stories. First story I thought of was the story of Joseph, the son of Jacob. He was kind of a snotty, bratty kid, but terribly, terribly smart, and a real pain in the neck to his brothers, and they were jealous of the status that their father had given him. He could be trusted by his father when they couldn't, and they sold him into slavery. And he was taken down to Egypt. And through many trials and tribulations, he rises to favor in the Egyptian government, and he becomes sort of a prime minister to the Pharaoh. And he is preparing the country for 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And in the middle of the famine, most 20 years after he was sold as a slave by his brothers, he sees them in their need as they come to Egypt to try to buy grain to keep themselves and their families alive. And he sees their need, and he does not say, now it's my turn to get them. What he says is, now is the time for God to act and reconcile, because his heart cared. And it's a beautiful story. You can begin reading that in the 37th chapter of Genesis all the way to the end of the book, which is chapter 50. Another story that came to my mind of someone who cared was Ruth. Ruth was a dark-skinned Moabite, a traditional enemy and even a cousin to Israel. And she is going to Bethlehem as a widow with her widowed mother-in-law because she cares. And there she takes the lowest possible status because that's all that's open to her, but a close relative to Naomi's deceased husband, Boaz, he cares. And he begins to plan a way to redeem them and include them back in the family lineage, back with the covenant people of God. And he does. And she, of course, becomes the great-grandmother of the legendary King David. Another story that touches me every time I read it about someone who cared was Hosea. Hosea was a prophet of rather significant standing in his community. And God tells him, I want you to marry a prostitute. So he obeys, and he finds Gomer, a prostitute. And of course, she is going to stand as a symbol for the way that Israel was running away from God. And she has 3 children, boom, 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 and none of them are his. And she, true to form, goes back to all of her cheating ways, and she's in everybody's bed, and then leaves him, and I think presumably with the 3 children, who are not his, and abandons him. And Hosea could not give up on her because God had told him not to. And you find him wandering around the seedy places of the city and in the red light districts and in the marketplace. And he does this for years. He's looking for her and just looking for what happened to her because God had given him a heart to care and to be responsible for her. And he was still legally her husband. And finally, he sees her one day in the slave market. She is naked, she is in chains, and she has been down a lot of bad road. And she is being sold as a slave on the cheap. And Hosea buys her. Now, what he doesn't do is say, serves you right. He takes her home. He dresses her. He puts the wedding ring back on her finger. He adopts her children and calls them his own. And he restores and renews and redeems her. And he cares because God cares. Another story that always touches me, because she could be so easily forgotten, and she was, but not by God, is the story of Hagar. She was a slave to Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Sarah cannot get pregnant, and she tells Abraham to lie with Hagar, and because she is her slave, her property, any child she have rightfully then is Sarah's. So Abraham lies with her, and they conceive, and a son is born. And before the son is born, Hagar is just hated by Sarah, but she has a bit of haughtiness to her, and Sarah is treating her cruelly, so Hagar runs away. And she's out in the desert, pregnant all alone, but God speaks to her and tells her to return. He will take care of her because God cares. Years later, her son Ishmael is a teen, but now the child of promise That was the promise to Abraham and Sarah was Isaac, and Isaac is a little boy. Ishmael is poking fun at him, and Sarah hates Ishmael in her heart. And she says basically to Abraham, throw that woman out. So, what a schmuck. He gives her some water and some bread and says, hey, this has been nice. Desert's that way. You go far enough, you get to Egypt. Great. Have a nice life. You're done. And what can she do? There's no one to protect her, no one to care. And they trek off into the desert. I don't know how long, but the water is gone, the bread is gone, and they're parched and dying of thirst. And she knows she's going to die, and she's going to see her son die, and her heart is broken. The pathos in this story is remarkable. She sets Ishmael off some distance from her. The Bible says a bow shot, the distance between an archer and where the arrow will land. And then she goes back to that distance and just weeps and wails because there's no one to care for her and her son. And that's when God speaks to her, tells her to look. And beside her then begins to spring up a artesian well of water that they can have some sustenance, and then God provides for her. And Ishmael, of course, becomes the father of the Arab nations. And that's because God cares. Because of who God is, God cares. Now, caring opens the heart to others. Caring takes the focus off ourselves and our own self-centered little concerns so we can see a bigger picture. And caring brings about compassion. Compassion moves us to act positively on behalf of others in the point of their need. God cared. God cared and cares from a heart of love. And that is what moved God to act in sending Jesus to be one of us, one with us, at the very point of our human need, because God cares. And that's a part of the story of the Grinch, that the Grinch began to care. Now think about the things that concerns Jesus about as we read about him in the Gospels. And how much then, if you read these lists, do you care about the things Jesus is concerned about, the things that Jesus cares about? So I'm going to ask you to pause the video and look up two passages of Scripture. One is Luke 4:18 and 19. So Jesus goes to his hometown, and he kind of puts out his mission statement there, Luke 4:18 and 19. And the other is the wonderful chapter in Matthew, chapter 25, where he begins to talk about the judgment. And the judgment is about caring. It's Matthew 25:31 to the end of the chapter. Take a few minutes and read them. Don't rush through them. Read through them carefully. And I'll be here when you put the video back on. Okay, you're back. The question to ask after reading those two passages is, what do you have to do, what do we have to do to rearrange our priorities so that they are more in line with the things that Jesus cares about, as we read about it in Luke chapter 4 and in Matthew 25. That's where this is going to be very important as a study point in this Advent journey. Because when we get to Christmas, it's not about the presents and the buttons and the bows and the bags and all that other stuff. It's about caring, because God cares for us. Now, there's one more significant point that we don't want to miss, and that's really also a part of the Grinch's story. And that is the song of the Who's down in Whoville. They welcomed Christmas in with singing. And it's the place from which the Grinch began to hear and care, because he heard the song and he realized that Christmas is held not in your hands but in your heart. So the carols of Christmas are not just tradition. They are really theology. So I'm going to ask you as a follow-up here to listen to the favorite carols you have of Christmas. Not Frosty, not Rudolph, and not that drummer boy. But The really great carols of Christmas, Silent Night, of course. It came upon a midnight clear. So many beautiful carols that really speak to the heart of us. And as you look and listen to these carols, what do you now believe about the Christmas story and how it applies to us from these carols? How do they speak to you? So that's where we'll wrap this up. I want to thank you who've watched all 4 episodes. I really appreciate that. Be glad to have some feedback. Be very interested in knowing what studies from the Bible you might be interested in doing. I'd love to do something on Francis of Assisi, love to do Ruth, love to do almost any book of the Bible. That would be fun. Ecclesiastes has a lot to offer. The love poetry and Song of Solomon. But I love doing the New Testament books, the Gospels, the letters. These are great things, and I'll wait to hear from you. But I'll be posting some more things in January. So have a wonderful Christmas, or whenever it is you're watching this, have a great day. God bless.